In this lesson, we'll look at creating a continuous stream of fluids from an object. Now this is our Houdini scene, picking up right where we left off. We have our flip fluid object, which we created from a sphere back at SOPs, and then we added a couple of pop forces here so that we can control our fluid using the particle control tools that we have here available in Houdini. Now, this is not the only way to add motion to your fluids here using these particle tools. In fact, I'm just going to disconnect these here for now. Just right-click on the thread in between and choose disconnect, so they're not connected. These nodes are now no longer influencing the simulation at all. Let's look directly at this flip fluid object node for a second. And you'll see here about midway down through the parameters is an option to initialize velocity. If we turn that on, we can now add velocity to our fluid right here directly on the flip fluid object inside of DOPS. Now with this on, I'm just going to add up maybe 4 positive x velocity and say 5 in positive y for velocity. If I rewind my timeline and click play, you can now see that my particles have some initial movement added to them. Okay? It's also important to note here inside the flip fluid object that this particular parameter, SOP path, all this does is it says where on the level above me up in SOPs do I need to look to get the initial shape for the particles that are going to create this fluid. Right now you can see that it's pointing to the object level and the sphere object 1 container. Let's jump back up and see what that looks like. So here's the object level, and inside the sphere object 1 container we find this node, sphere 1. Now sphere 1 is what's actually defining the shape of this particular fluid. So since it's going to be the actual source of our fluids, let's go ahead and just rename this the source. Now I oftentimes will do this so I know just by looking at my object level exactly where my fluids are coming from. So this is the source node. We'll dive inside now, and instead of this sphere, what happens if we lay down a torus? Now I'm going to do that by just using tab and typing out TORUS. That'll bring up the torus geometry. Oh, and I have to click on it, which I did not do. So come over here, click on the torus. That'll lay down this shape of a torus. Now, even though that shape of the torus exists inside of here, because the sphere 1 node has the render flag, it's what's being called out of the major container of source. So now let's go back here to AutoDOPS real quick and just look back at our flip fluid object. The flip fluid object is looking at the source container. So whatever has the render flag for that entire container is what it's going to pull to get the initial shape for this fluid. Well, we have these options here on the right of the SOP path parameter. Now the first option, this little arrow that looks like a shortcut arrow, is just that. It will take you to the node that's listed here directly. So if you wanted to change anything about the sphere, you could easily click on this little icon and it will take you back to object level and highlight the source because that's what we had selected in AutoDOPS. So let's go back to our AutoDOP network now and look at this second option that we have here on the right. Now the second option here on the right actually lets us pick what is going to go into this parameter. And you'll notice we can dive deeper than just the surface container. So if I wanted to, instead of the sphere that we have out here, I can choose the torus and click accept. And now instantly my fluid shape is now a torus instead of the sphere. So what this means is that you can choose any node from any parameter that is geometry as a source for your fluids. And just remember that if you ever need to see exactly what you're dealing with here, for some reason source torus 1 isn't named correctly or you're lost, all you have to do is just click on this little shortcut arrow and Houdini will automatically take you to that node that is plugged into that parameter back in AutoDOPS. Well, now that we've looked at how we can source from an object and initialize velocity from that object, what happens if we want to do something more like, say, a garden water hose or a waterfall where we have a continuous stream of fluids instead of just a shape that is turned into fluids? Well, to do that, we're going to look at the emit Particle Fluids tool. Let's go ahead and just start with a brand new scene. So I'm just going to go File and New. And this will open a brand new clean Houdini scene for us. And let's go ahead and put in here just a, let's use a box. We'll control click on box. So all we have in our scene right now is this box object 1. We dive inside, and of course inside the container all we have is a box. I'll use my select tool from the left hand side tool set here. Grab that box and come up to Emit Particle Fluid. Now I'm going to click on that, and I get this prompt here in the bottom of the viewport that says, now select a fluid or fluid box to add source to. No selection will create a new fluid. And since I don't have any fluids that I'm working with yet, we want to create a brand new one. So I have nothing selected, and go ahead and tap Enter. Houdini does its thing, and we get this. So we've had several changes now to our interface since we hit that shelf tool. Let's do a little bit of exploring and see what's going on here. So the first things that we notice is we have our particle fluid interior and our particle fluid, which, as we discussed in a previous lesson, mainly are used for rendering the fluids out. So let's go ahead and scoot those out of the way here. And we have our box object 1. We've also been given, of course, our AutoDOP network, which holds all of the heart of the movement of the simulation. So let's jump in there and see what we've got going on. Double click to dive inside. I've got a bit of a mess here in my network, but I know that I have a keyboard shortcut I can use to lay this out so that it's viewed a lot easier. And that's just tapping L on the keyboard. So I'm going to tap L. Lays my nodes out all easy here where I can see them. And it looks like I have some things that are different here. Some new nodes that I haven't seen before from sourcing that actual box. So we have our flip fluid object. Wait a minute, there's nothing in the SOP path. Now, as we looked at just a second ago, we needed to have something here so that we know how to get this shape to begin with, right? So we know we have a box, we have a fluid that's been created from the box, but we're not getting it sourced here in the source path for the flip fluid object. Instead, what the Houdini has done is it's used this third input on the flip solver. Now you remember, the first one here is for our flip fluid object. The second one was for our particle velocity, and we know this by middle clicking on that input. You can see right here. Now, on the second input, we have volume velocity, and we'll get to that in just a second, but the third one is for sourcing. Okay? So basically what this does is it will create a continuous source of fluid from whatever is plugged into this input. So in this case, we have this source surface from box object node, right? Let's go ahead and highlight that. Look at our parameters view, and what we can see is that we have a node called a source volume node. And that source volume node has been automatically named source surface from box object 1. Here we can see that we have a volume path parameter, and it is pointing to our box object. So instead of using the flip object's SOP path to get the shape, we're now using this input on the far right hand side of the flip solver called source, and we're plugging into it this volume from SOPs called box object 1 out surface. Right? So what exactly is this volume that we're working with? Where is it coming from? Well, we can use our little shortcut here to jump over to that node. So let's go ahead and click on that. And where does it take us? It takes us over to the box object 1, which we looked at just before we created this emission of fluids. And all we had in here was just box 1. Well, when we used the shelf tool, it added into the network this create surface volume, this merge surface volumes, and this out surface node. Of course, it also made this render node, which we'll discuss here in just a second. If we look at this create surface volume node, we can see that we have a lot of parameters here. We've got scalar volumes, velocity volumes, particles, container settings, and all kinds of stuff down here at the bottom under each one of them. Well, what do those do exactly, and how do they control the look and motion of my fluid that I just created? Well, that's what we're going to look at in the next lesson.